Hello everyone, welcome to our interviews for the South American Mycorrhizal Research Network. Today I am with Marcus Caiafa and Matthew Smith. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So Marcus, you are a postdoc at the University of California, Riverside, and before that you did your PhD in the lab of Matthew Smith at the University of Florida. And you recently published a very interesting study in the journal Current Biology called Discovering the Role of Patagonian Birds in the Dispersal of Truffles and Other Mycorrhizal Fungi. So first of all, how do these birds disperse the mycorrhizal fungi?
Well, that's a really good question. And this start with the previous work that Matt has done in Patagonia, and truffling and collecting a lot of ectomycorrhizal fungi in the Nothofagus forest. And we noticed that these birds, they usually are ground-dwelling birds. They forage a lot on the ground. They are very generalist eaters. Basically, what we show in this study is that besides all the things that have been reported, that invertebrates and seeds, these birds also eat a lot of fungi. Among those fungi, there's also a lot of truffles that are being eaten by these birds. And once they eat them, in some point they have to defecate, and when they defecate, they are dispersing the spores through mycophagy.
And so you made all these observations, but then can you explain to us how did you demonstrate it, that the bird eat the fungi, defecate, and disperse the spores that way?
What we did was going to the forest, watch the birds, and try to collect the fecal material from the birds. We had two different approaches. One was trying to catch the bird, put them in a cloth bag, and wait until they produce a fecal sample. And the other approach that we use was just to watch the bird until they poop, and then collect the fecal sample. When you are watching birds, they defecate a lot. It's they eat and defecate all day. So it's if you spend some time watching the birds, you eventually are gonna be able to get a fecal sample. So what we did is once we got all these fecal samples, we extract DNA, and we use a high throughput sequencing technologies to have an idea of the fungal community that was present in these fecal samples. And we also collect some soil to have sort of control and make sure that the fungi that we're seeing in the fecal samples was a different community than the one that was in the soil. We also did some microscopy to identify some of the spore morphologies that we were able to see. And we also use a very interesting method that is the epifluorescent microscopy, that you basically can differentially stain spores. We use a stain is called propylium iodide that binds on the DNA. But since it's a very big molecule, only penetrates on the spores that are physically damaged. Because that give us an idea what spores are viable and are likely to germinate.
I see. Yes. And at the end, you identified quite a lot of species. If I am correct, more than 7,000 O2s estimated, right, in the fecal samples. So what kind of fungi did you find in these fecal samples?
Quite a lot. And I think that this paper only shows a little bit of the data that we collect. And particularly because we wanted to focus on mycorrhizal fungi. But there are saprobes, animal-associated fungi, and of course a lot of things that we don't really know what they are.
Do you think that that's the new way to describe fungal diversity in Patagonia? Now people should go and look into scats and unravel some unknown groups, for example, or?
I mean, I see it as useful when it's done synergistically. I mean, for example, before we started collecting a lot of truffles over time, there just weren't very many sequences of truffle-like fungi. So for example, in our paper, we have a figure which identifies all the things that we know form truffle fruiting bodies. And the majority of those were collections that were made by our lab group plus our collaborators, and then we sequenced them. And without doing that over a period of several years and a lot of sequences, we wouldn't have been able to match up what we had. We would have been able to say which taxonomic group it belonged to, but we wouldn't have been able to say those were truffles, 5 or 6 years ago. So I think it sort of requires both things. I mean, this paper, we found a lot of really cool stuff that you couldn't find just by going out in the woods and collecting fungi and bringing them back and sequencing them. But without having done that already, this paper would have been a lot harder to do. So I do think if they're done together, it's better.
Well, I think one thing that was like proof of what Matt is saying is like we found like particularly two truffle species that we described this year, and we only knew that they were truffles because we had those specimens. That's the only way. Like otherwise, we would never.
You would have thought maybe it's a epigeous fungi.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and 2 of them were sequestrate inosebes, and before we had found those, we didn't actually know there were sequestrate inosebes in southern South America because it's not a common thing. There's only a handful of species described for the world, and so we just wouldn't have known that if we hadn't spent that time in the field collecting the fungi as well.
I see. And so for the general audience, could you explain what are truffles in general, and why do you think that these birds consume so much of them in this forest?
So I would say we use the word truffles in the very broad sense that when we say truffles, we're talking about all fungi that form these enclosed fruiting structures where the spores are inside of the fruiting body and they're never coming out unless they're released by animals or if they basically rot away and then the spores go into the soil. So truffle-like fungi just is a very broad definition for these fungi that are not necessarily closely related to one another. It's been convergent evolution that's selected for this enclosed structure. And we also included in there secodioid fungi, which have an enclosed spore mass, but it's usually on a stalk of varying lengths. So that's also included in our definition in the broad sense. And then in terms of why these birds are feeding on them and what they're feeding on, well, in the paper we talk about what they're feeding on, and it's a lot of different species. It definitely seems like there are some species that they eat a lot, so they may prefer some species over others, but we didn't really have enough information to say much about that. We had a broad enough sampling that we could say what they ate, but not which ones they liked the best. And we had hoped to address that, but COVID kind of got in the way for some. And then the other thing is, I think part of why they're eating them is because they're there. And these birds just eat a lot of other things, as Marco said. So they eat invertebrates, they eat fruits, they eat seeds. And so, these things look like food and they try them and they probably like the taste of them. And I'm sure that they have some nutritional value. We don't really know because this is new. Many of the things aren't even described species. We don't know like much about their nutritional value, but I suspect that they do have nutritional value for the birds based on other species in other places.
And so these truffles, they have an enclosed fruiting body. They do need to be consumed by animals to be dispersed, right? What most people know about truffles are actually the true truffle, the genus tuber, because they have a lot of aroma, and so they're used in France in the gastronomy. So the idea behind this is that they have this aroma so that because they are below ground, animals can smell them and so they will dig them. But so what about the birds that consume these fungi because they don't really have these high olfactory senses?
I think that there's probably different ways that you can forage and look for truffles. And I think this idea that truffles are just giving off strong odors to attract their mammal dispersers. Like it's not necessarily true for birds. And omnivorous birds, they tend to like not have like a very strong sense of smell. What we think, and it's something I would like to test like further, is like these birds, they eat what they see. So like basically they use like some like visual cues to find their food. At least one of these birds, like the wet-wets, they like constantly like scratching the leaf litter and removing the soil. I think that's probably the way that they are like finding those truffles, just because they see them. And of course, some of them are very, very colorful, and there's some like bright purple ones, there's some white and yellow ones. And there's like this very interesting case of this truffle called like Cystangium Nothofagus that reflects like UV light. So that was like a really, really interesting conversation that I had with an ornithologist. I was like presenting this in a conference. So this guy says like, oh well, but you could like try like just with like a UV lamp and see if the truffles are reflecting the UV light. And it's something as a mycologist I never thought before. So we just like brought like a UV light that Matt had, and like we took it to the field and we just tested out, and like very interestingly, yeah, some species they do reflect UV light. And we know also that some birds are more sensitive to the UV spectrum. So yeah, it's possible that they're also like are being able to see like the truffles like differently than us.
And how important do you think that these birds play a role for the dispersal of these fungi compared to other species that are simply dispersed by air? Do you see some differences in the distribution of these truffles, that somehow they're more widespread? Because we know that most of the spores dispersed by air current, they fell very close to the fruiting body, not even 1 meter, I think, for the majority of the spores. So do you think that there is a lot more long distance dispersal because of the birds?
Particularly like these two birds, they tend to be like territorial. So like for the chucaos, there's a smaller bird. They have like territories of about like 1 hectare. The bigger birds, they have like territories of about like 4 hectares. So that's probably like the range that they will be moving. Still, it's like way more than a few meters.
But none of these birds do migration.
No, like those two, no. Okay. But there's like some interesting thing is like we also collect some samples from other birds, and there's one bird that seems to be eating like quite a few fungi.
The austral thrush.
Yeah, and it's like a close relative to the to the robins in North America. And they do migrate a little bit. But that was like also like some like very unexpected result. I never thought that they would be eating fungi as well.
What that suggested to me is that there may be a lot of other birds that are doing this. And the other thing that I think is relevant to note is that in the older literature, people used to focus a lot on specialists that only ate truffles or ate truffles for a huge portion of their diet. And there certainly are some mammals that fit that description where they really seem to specialize on truffles, or at least for part of the year or something, they really eat a lot of truffles. But for these birds, based on our observations and other studies, it's likely they're not specializing in any way on truffles. But for those truffles that they are eating, it's really important because if they aren't eaten, all the spores will basically remain in one spot. Whereas if a couple of the truffles get eaten, even if only half the truffle fruiting body is eaten and they get taken 30 meters away, well, that's a huge distance that would be really hard to travel on their own. So for truffle fungi, it's pretty critical to have those animals. And the other thing is in this system, there are not necessarily a ton of ground-dwelling mammals around that would be doing that dispersal. So I think they're probably really important for the fungi. How important the fungi are for the birds, I think, is a little more debatable because we don't know, and especially because we don't know about the nutrition. But certainly for those truffles, I would think it's pretty important. The other thing I think that's kind of interesting that you find among the truffle fungi is quite often they have a really thick spore wall, and often they have not always, but often they have a lot of ornamentation to the spore wall. And there's a lot of, speculation that might be partly selected for over time by passing through the guts of animals. So, the spores that make it through the guts that have a tougher wall or more ornaments are going to be the ones that are going to germinate to form new individuals. So it's a mode of selection for tougher spores potentially. And so that means those ones that are being eaten and passing through the guts, when they are deposited somewhere in a nutrient packet, that they also are going to be likely the ones that are the tough ones that are going to be present in the soil in the spore pool that's available to the plants for forming mycorrhizae.
Yes. Yeah, and so finally, these birds, because of all this interaction with the fungi, but also with the ectomycorrhizal plants, that they're very important for the conservation of this forest. I was thinking of the example, I don't know if you've heard of it, about the empty forest. It's a phenomenon when you have forests that have been emptied of animals that were hunted heavily. And so this theory is more related with the seed dispersal. But do you think that this is also something that somehow could be applied to the mammals, or in this case, the birds dispersing these fungi for the conservation of this forest and the dispersal of not only the fungi, but also the plants?
I think in all disturbed forests, once you reach a certain level of disturbance and above, you're likely to lose some ectomycorrhizal fungi and other trophic modes of fungi. In this case, I think you could make the argument that, well, if some of the truffles are disappearing, one of the reasons might be that the organisms that are dispersing those truffles aren't there, or they're disturbed, so you don't get the same patterns of spore dispersal. It certainly would be something that you'd want to keep in mind when you're thinking about conservation. And it's also part of why you probably need forests of a certain size and condition for conservation to really work, because, like these birds, Marcos was saying, they have territories of a certain size. So you need pieces of forest that are big enough for them to make a territory or more than one together for that to work.
Also, like these birds, and that's like there's a lot of research has been done like with these birds, and one of our collaborators for this paper, like she's actually one of the experts on these on these birds. It seems like they are very sensitive to like forest fragmentation. Since they're like understory birds, and they don't fly that much. They mostly walk. But they
definitely don't like to fly over large open areas.
Yeah, they would never fly like open areas. So like So like it would be really hard for them to move to one patch to another if there's like a giant field.
Excellent. Field. Okay, thank you very much. And well, before we stop, Marcos, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what you're doing at the moment? And maybe, are you still working on these topics?
Right now, for my postdoc, I'm working on some different things, mostly with fungi and bacteria in post-fire environments here in California and Colorado. But yeah, I have some plans to follow up on this. I think this research also opens a lot of interesting questions in terms of the role of these birds on the dispersal. Would be something I would like to look into. Would be some population studies to see some pattern in the populations of these truffles. So yeah, that's some of the things that are in my mind.
Do you plan to buy UV glasses and walk in the forest?
That would be cool.
Looking for truffles, everyone. You can do that.
The challenge, I think, too, was that when Marcos was here, we really wanted to go back to Chile 2 years in a row, and the world was in a state of disarray. So it just wasn't possible to go follow up on some of the things that we wanted to do. But I'm hopeful that we can get back and do some of the things in the future. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, and hopefully this nice publication will also incentivate other people to start to look more into bird mycophagy. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, and we will be back soon with more interviews for the South American Mycosal Research Network. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.